Hey, what's going on, guys? Just wanted to film another video today talking about what baits I like to throw depending on the rod size and the line size that you're using. So when it comes to spinning rod fishing, that normally means lighter line, smaller bait. You're fishing for more pressured fish, so that means overall downsizing your technique. So one thing to keep in mind when you're doing that when it comes to spinning rod fishing is lighter line. I see a lot of people using 15, 20, 30 pound braid, and that's fine, but if you're fishing for fish that are really pressured, I like to go as small as I can go and get by with. So I like 10 pound braid personally. That's just my personal opinion. I think 10 pound braid is overall a better size braid to use on a spinning rod for pretty much any application in bass fishing, because you get longer cast. And that's got to be one of the most important things when it comes to fishing for pressured fish is long cast. And I've noticed, because trust me, I've used 20, I've used 30, I've used 15, I've used it all. But 10 pound braid is by far the best size braid that fits me good when it comes to making long casts, still setting the hook hard, not breaking off. And I use a leader to that too, so it's not just 10 pound braid and just to my bait. I usually have a leader on there, depending on what bait I'm using. But I normally like to match my fluorocarbon with the size braid that I'm using. So for example, if I'm using 10 pound braid, I want to use 10 pound fluorocarbon. You can go a little higher, but I wouldn't recommend too much higher, because your knot from your braid to your fluoro is not going to be as good as 10 to 10 would be if it was braid to fluorocarbon. And it just goes off your rods a lot smoother, through the eyes a lot smoother. Yeah, I found that really helps me out when it comes to throwing a spinner rod. And something else I kind of want to mention to you. So an overall good size spinner rod when it comes to bass fishing and finesse fishing is either, to me personally, I like a 610 or I like a 7.2. And when I'm using 10 pound braid to 10 pound fluoro, I usually am using smaller baits, drop shots, light shaky heads, little small crankbaits, little swim baits, and that normally means lighter hooks. So that's another thing to keep in mind when it comes to rod size and line size, is if you're using heavy line, you kind of want to match that with the hook. So if you're using 20 pound braid to 15 or 20 pound fluoro, you want to have a bigger hook for that. That way it kind of matches up and you get a better hookup ratio. But if you have lighter line, lighter braid, lighter fluorocarbon, you want to go smaller hook so you get better penetration. And that's one of the most important things when it comes to line size on all sorts of rods, all sorts of braid, all sorts of line, all sorts of baits. That's got to be the most important thing that I've found. So keep that in mind whenever you're using spinner rods. Like I said, either a 610 or 7.2 is my favorite, and you can pretty much use that for any baits. Usually, especially a 7.2 or 7.1. Favorite makes a 7.1 6 stick, which is by Brian Latimer, awesome spinner rod. I have a few of them myself. They make a 7.2 hex, which is a very, very nice spinner rod as well, and they make a 610, which is another nice spinner rod that you can use for anything. They pretty much cover all aspects. The 610 is for a little lighter stuff, drop shot, Ned rig, that sort of thing. But the 7.1 by Brian and the 7.2 hex you can pretty much use for anything. And they have all other sorts of spinner rods as well, in case you're not wanting those in particular. But they do have other spinner rods, so keep that in mind whenever it comes to fishing light tackle, light braid, light fluorocarbon on a spinner rod. So first things first, when it comes to spinning rods, that normally means lighter line. So for me, I like 10 pound braid, especially for bass fishing. 10 pound braid to 10 pound fluorocarbon or less usually. I will go up to 12 occasionally, but I don't ever go higher than 12 when I'm using a spinner rod with 10 pound braid. The reason being is because usually when you're using a spinner rod with that size line, you're using lighter hooks for that situation. So right here I have a hook, for example, that I might use sometimes. This is just a Dirty Jigs swim bait head right there. It's a light hook. You can see it right there. It's a light wire hook. So that's why I'm using a smaller rod. I use a 610 spinning rod for this type of thing. That way I don't bend the hook out, for example, if I get a big fish on, or you set the hook too hard and bend the hook out. with that 10-pound braid and that 10-pound fluoro or less, you're pretty much good to go on any hook, on any size hook, or any small bait, for example, on a spinning rod. That way, it's kind of equivalent to each other. You don't want to use a huge hook, like a flipping hook on a Texas rig with a spinning rod with that size line, or you'll never get the hook in the fish. You need something that kind of matches the same level, hook, rod, line, everything flows together. That way you just have a better hookup. When it comes to the end of the day in bass fishing, hookup ratio is probably the most important thing, obviously, and that's just something that'll help you out for the future. So stepping it up just a little bit, next for me would be a jerkbait. This is a jerkbait right here. It's got 3 treble hooks on it, as you can see. These are number 6 treble hooks. They're light wire treble hooks, so that means a smaller rod, lighter line. So for a jerkbait, for example, I like a 610 rod, is 6'8", 6'10", something like that. For example, right here I have a favorite. This is just a favorite, 6'8". This right here, I love it. It's a moderate fast action, so when they bite it, it kind of lets them eat it. It's got a good tip on it. It don't bend the hooks out because it's not too big a rod. So a jerkbait is something that you don't want to use a 7.2 or a 7.4 or a 7.6. You never want to use a heavy for a jerkbait. It always needs to be a medium heavy, something in that nature. Even a medium, even lighter than that, could be a medium fast, something like that. That way, when these fish eat these small hooks like this, and you set the hook or lean into them, you don't bend these hooks straight out. Because I promise you that if you have 18-pound line on here with a 7.4 heavy rod, and you have these size hooks on here, you will bend these hooks out on the fish. So kind of keep that in mind when it comes to jerkbait fishing. I like 10 or 12-pound line. That's the only line I use when I jerkbait. It gives that jerkbait more action, side-to-side action. If you have bigger line, bigger diameter line, the jerkbait's not going to get as much action to it. Same thing as hooks. If you have big hooks on a jerkbait, it will not get that much action. The smaller hooks you can go, the more action that bait's going to have. The lighter line you can go, the more action it's going to have. And the smaller rod, the better hookup you're going to have. So kind of keep those things in mind. And that's something else, even like crankbait fishing. If you're crankbait fishing, keep that in mind. 10, 12-pound line normally, all the time for crankbaits. If you're deep cranking, 12 or 14 usually. That's about as high as I'll go. And for a rod, so if you're using a smaller crankbait, like a 610 6-stick by Favorite, and that's designed by Brian Latimer. It's a composite rod, so it's got a great backbone, but it's also got a very soft tip. So when they eat that crankbait, it lets them get these back trebles really good. That way you don't snatch it out of their mouth, and that's what that rod's designed for. Is just crankbait fishing. So, and you can use it for a jerkbait as well. So that way when a fish comes up and it's cold and they barely get the bait, you still got a good hook in them, and that's the most important thing, is rod, line, and hooks when it comes to jerkbait fishing / crankbait fishing. So keep that in mind. So stepping it up even a little more, I'm talking 16, 18, 20-pound line. That normally means bigger hooks. So for example, right here, you have a big hook. This is a jackhammer chatterbait by Z-Man. It's got a sturdy hook on it. This joker does not bend out, and that's why I use bigger line and a bigger rod. So chatterbait fishing, for example, you're going to be fishing around grass, docks, woods, anything. You can really throw chatterbait around anything, but you're going to be making long casts for the most part. So that bigger rod and that bigger line is very important to have a good hookup ratio. So kind of think about this. If you're using a 610 rod for chatterbait fishing and you have 12-pound line on there, well, if you make a long cast and you get bit on the end of that cast, that big hook right there is not going to go inside that fish. You're not going to get the hookup you want. Yes, you will land some fish, but I'm telling you, if you go bigger line, bigger rod, your hookup will go up by 10 times. It'll be 10 times as much on your hookup. And I still lose fish, and I feel like, this is just my opinion, but I feel like I have it down to the T when it comes to chatterbait fishing on the technique that I like. And I still lose fish. That's just part of fishing. But to help you out, I totally think that, anywhere between 16 and 20-pound line for a chatterbait, anywhere between a 7.2 rod to a 7.6, depending on the action and depending on what kind of cover you're fishing, that is very, very important for having better hookups, for getting that bigger hook into the fish, like you see right there, that bigger hook into the fish, and getting the hookup ratio that you want. So kind of keep that in mind. Bigger hook usually means bigger line, bigger rod for a longer cast, and that sort of thing. So kind of keep that in mind when it comes to stepping it up a little bit. All right, so the main thing that I feel like people kind of mess up in a way, and this is just my opinion, like I said, this is my opinion, but something that I feel like could help people out more than anything is when they're throwing Texas rigs. I'll see people throwing a lot of rods that are 6 foot rods, 6'8" rods, 6'10" rods, and that's all fine depending on what size hook you're using. But normally for a Texas rig, you're using a little more of a sturdy hook, so that means you're using a bigger line and you need to be using a bigger rod. For me personally, I like a 7.2 medium heavy or 7.3 medium heavy. That is like the ideal Texas rig rod for any hook you may be using, for any line size, 16 to 20. That's normally what I use when it comes to Texas fishing, because you're making long casts. You may be throwing a speed worm and reeling it out there and you get bit on the end of the cast. Well, that 7.2 medium heavy has got enough backbone, it's got a good enough tip to get that fish in, instead of something that might be a 6 foot rod, a 6'8", 6'10", even a 7 footer. It might be very hard to get a good hookup on that fish way out like that. Now, there's a couple different hooks when it comes to Texas rig fishing. You got a wide gap, you got a straight shank, you got that sort of thing, and those rods are great for that. But you know, besides Texas rig fishing is flipping and pitching, and that's when you step it up even more with the hook and even more with the rod and line. So this hook right here, you see it, that's a flipping hook, that's a pitching hook. This joker does not bend out. And when you're flipping into cover like that, and you're flipping into trees and bushes and grass and you know, whatever it may be, you need to have a bigger rod and bigger line to get those fish out of there. So for me personally, I like a 7.8 rod. That is a great size rod overall for pitching and flipping. You can use it for both. MDJ designed his own with favorite. It's a hex. Awesome rod. Definitely my favorite flipping and pitching rod I've ever put in my hands. Very light, very sensitive. Gets them out of there. I use all the way up to 1.5 ounces on it, sometimes 1 3/4 ounces, and it does a job. I use all the way down to a 3/4 on it. So that's when I kind of step it up. If I'm doing that sort of fishing, I go 65-pound braid all the time. Get them in there, get them out, no problem with this hook right here. But you got to think about it. If you have a smaller rod, like a 7.2 medium heavy, 7.3 medium heavy, and you're using braid, and you flip way back in there, you know, and you're using that braid, that doesn't mean you're necessarily going to get those fish out. Yeah, you may get a good hookup, but if you flip way back in there and you set the hook on those fish, that rod sometimes is not going to be big enough or sturdy enough to get them out. So you have to kind of have something that, you know, makes it equivalent to the way you're fishing. So like I said, the 7.8 hex is a great rod to get way back in there, get that fish out of there when you get them on. As in other words, a little smaller rod may struggle to get them out. Yes, it can work, but just to better your hookup and better your fish landing ratio, bigger rod size when it comes to flipping and pitching is very important as well. So I hope that kind of helps you guys out a little bit. There's a lot of other techniques I didn't go over, but just trying to cover the basis when it comes to it. So just kind of go over it one more time for you. Lighter hook means lighter line, lighter rod, smaller rod. Now when you start stepping it up to something like a jerkbait, you know, like a 6'8", 6'10" rod, 12-pound line, 10-pound line, that way you don't bend those hooks out. When it comes to flipping and pitching, you need a 7'8", you need something big, something to get them out of there. You need braid so you don't break them off. You need a sturdy hook as well, because the hook is going to match that rod size, if that makes any sense. So just try to keep those things in mind. That's something that I've learned growing up, and something that's definitely helped me out when it comes to landing fish. So yeah, I hope that helped you out. And if you would, leave a like, comment, and subscribe.